Vaughn Baker, our speaker this evening, is a 12th generation native of the Eastern Shore. Born in Salisbury, he earned a degree in business administration from the University of Maryland. For much of his adult life, he has been heavily involved in the sports industry. He operated the Baker Company for 4 decades with multiple contracts with some of the most famous names in sporting goods. In addition, Mr. Baker has introduced and managed a variety of sporting goods companies and lines with international markets. On a more regional level, Mr. Baker has served as a past executive director of the Ward Museum of Wildfowl Art and also as chairman of the Edward H. Knabb Research Center for Delmarva History and Culture at SU. Following a passion which he has held for many years, Mr. Baker has done decades of research on the earliest families on the Eastern Shore, including many families which he is intimately connected with. Tonight, he will give a presentation on the 1614 document which consisted of some of the early settlers of the Eastern Shore. He will also speak on the 1624 census and on the various social, economic, political connections of the earliest European families on the Eastern Shore. He will draw on the transatlantic connections of many of these families. His focus will be on some of the earlier settlers, their kinships, and their roots back in England and the Low Countries. He will also discuss the first Quaker settlement and assorted early land scams, as well as a little sin. You are sure to enjoy Mr. Baker's presentation, Kin and Sin, Early Settlers of the Eastern Shore. Mr. Baker?
Good, I couldn't have said it better. Thank you. I want to give you a sense of the first 50 years of colonization here on the Eastern Shore, and from some of the research that I've done, which is a totally different look at how some of this history has come about. I was as an international businessman, I was overseas, and being overseas, I ran into some Dutch folks. This gentleman is down in Africa now on an assignment, but he has a master's in Dutch history in the late 1500s, and also is an expert on Dutch handwriting. And I'd given the names of some of these English soldiers who had been in the Low Countries that I thought was connected with early Virginia, and he would go in and do the research and go through these files. And the folks were fascinated about Pocahontas, so I would, each trip over, I'd take postcards of Pocahontas or whatever I could find, and periodically we'd end up buying some things just to keep the folks happy. So at the end of 45 minutes, we'll have a question and answer, and after that, I hope I have given you some sense of how wonderful this Eastern Shore history that we have is, and how different and unique it is. So let's go back just for a second. So the Virginia Company was an organization of stockholders in London formed in 1606. And the following year they landed in Jamestown with 100 people. Mortality was terrible. The next 7 years was terrible. In 1614, for security reasons, they tried to expand. There was an expansion onto the Eastern Shore, 1614, we'll talk about in a moment. And economically, it was just a disaster until the year 1619 when tobacco as a product kicked in. And the very first plantation on the Eastern Shore was a company plantation. In other words, it was owned and operated by the Virginia Company. 1614, Lieutenant Craddock was sent to come across from the Jamestown, brought men to fish and to extract salt from the seawater and send that back to Jamestown. Also to provide a lookout for Spanish ships of war. In the early times I studied that, I thought, well, what are the chances of that happening? But actually, the Governor Gates, who was the governor up until 1614, was involved in the raid on St. Augustine, Florida, which was held by the Spanish. So it's reasonable to assume that the Spanish would have attacked Jamestown. This lower dot is where they operated on what we know as Smith's Island off of the tip of the Eastern Shore. And later they migrated up, and the upper dot there is where the 1624 census plantation, which was a Palisades fort, was taken. So if you drive south on 13, right before you go across the bridge, you'll see Augustus Tomb. Right next to the right of the Augustus Tomb is where that Palisades Fort was located. That land was called Dale's Gift at one earlier time, and I had no idea who Dale was. I knew that my ancestor was on Dale's Gift, so I thought I better figure out who Dale was. I then spent the next 20 years on a detour. I've probably researched Thomas Dale more than anyone else in the world. And here's some research that was done, some archaeology digs to find the post holes for the fort. And Dale was given land here on the eastern shore, and he was given land on the upper James River. And those two seem to be connected. So where do these folks come from? Well, we know they came from England. They came from the north of England, the central. Bristol was an active area. London, Kent, where seafarers came. But there were also administrators and soldiers involved in Ireland. And we get some of those folks coming over. And we get administrators and soldiers in the Low Country around Rotterdam, around Ostend, around Calais, who were English volunteers who had volunteered to support the Dutch Protestant forces against the Spanish army, which the Pope was the Pope's right-hand band, and he sent them in to subdue the Dutch. So I started, and also I'm a technology guy, and so I'm traveling all the time, and I'm putting this information in computers and writing little programs looking for things that seem to be related. So that's how I come about this differently than if I was sitting here at the NAB Center, which is a wonderful place to come to, but I couldn't do that on an airplane. And one of the other things I discovered is out of the Low Country there was a high migration into the Caribbean islands. And I don't think we study this enough. We know that there's movement from Virginia back into the islands, but the population in the islands was much stronger, much heavier than it was in the colonial Virginia. And so there's much happening in the Caribbean, and I'll mention some of it as we speak tonight. And why did they come? Well, the most common reason given for economic reasons, the population of England at that time, 1600, will floor you, it was only between 3 and 4 million people. And 14 out of 15 of those people were desperately poor, incredibly poor. And then if you were on the winning side of that, the 250,000 people, roughly 250,000 people, were living in the best circumstances as they could at the time. My research showed, though, more often than not, there was someone in their affinity, an overlord, a wealthy uncle, a brother who had invested in the Virginia Company and asked these folks to come over and keep an eye on their investment. After all, the mortality rate was only, was only 50%, so you can do that you should be able to do that for your brother. And men from Kent, and I also should say Bristol, were excellent sailors. Many had participated in the Low Countries, and so these folks were more fit to come into a continent and into a colony and live under the harshest conditions that these folks lived under. And what were they looking for? Well, for one, they were looking for a western passage to the Spice Islands. That would be the primary reason. The Spice Wars were going on at this moment in on the other side of the world. Spices, by the time spices got to Europe, there had been multiple princes and thugs who had forced their piece to be added to it. So spices were very, very expensive. So if you could get those and bring them around, as Drake did, it was a tremendous fortune to be made. And once they took on the Spanish and tried to sort that out, the Dutch and the English began to take on each other. There was a contingent also who wanted to use the Chesapeake as a port to refurbish and resupply ships. And they'd go out, privateers, and attack these Spanish ships loaded with gold and silver. And if they got a hit, it was big. It was a huge amount of money. And then there were those guys who just wanted to find some product and send it back. Wood was getting really scarce in England, so take this wood and ship it back, and other various items. And then, oh, by the way, let's help those natives learn our religion. We always hear how important the religion was, but I think it was a more, oh, by the way, as it was a strategic reason to come over. Probably people would disagree with me on that, but that's my thought. So I spent 3 decades studying Baker and 2 decades studying Dale, and what I hoped was I would find a place where those two would overlap, because that would tell me, not only for my ancestor, I might find more about the roots of the people here on the Eastern Shore. And what I did discover is that there was, between the Low Country, and when I say Low Country, I should probably include Ireland, because they were pulling these officers and enlisted men back and forth from these various, from Ireland and France, any place there was a problem going on. So they were at any of the military types. And Ashford, Kent becomes a real central focus in my research of where early colonization in Virginia took place. Ashford, as you can see, is all the way over here on the side of England, but if you just expand out of there, very near the Low Countries. So I told you economically it was a real mess until 1619. John Rolfe, who incidentally, Thomas Dale, a Dale's Gift, was his mentor. Rolfe finally got his tobacco after 4 or 5 years of experimentation. It really hit stride. And so that same year, every tillable acre they were using to raise tobacco. Berkeley Plantation was established very near Thomas Dale's other property on the James River, and the big money behind that was William Throckmorton. And incidentally, there's a little known fact, first Thanksgiving, and it's documented, was well before the Pilgrims came over. So let me ask you, how important is public relations? Huh? They didn't get it. And then there was another one that same year, Smith Hundred, 80,000 acres. And it was started by a fellow named Thomas Smith. And Thomas Smith brought a fellow over named Ensign William Epps. His family was the overlord of Epps. And 80,000 acres, huge undertaking. What's really interesting is, in my research, Throckmorton and Smith were 2 of the 4 overseers in Thomas Dale's will. So what was that relationship? And tonight I'm going to be talking all about these kinships and relationships. And they become a tool to begin to research your topic and become a tool to sort of verify that you're going down the right path. Guys, remember that. But what I found is that settlers were totally dependent on the Native Americans for their food crops. And the natives are saying, hey, in our history, we say some guys in a boat that are white guys in a boat are going to come over and take our country. So you would have thought, can you imagine an entire society dependent on their enemy for a raw material? Can you imagine? But we learn from history, don't we? One spring day in 1622, the entire Indian nation along the James River struck. Between the massacre, the subsequent injuries, the starvation, you see they weren't growing crops, and it's hard to ask your enemy to send you corn, almost wiped out the entire colony. And it's sometimes written that during this period there were discussions. There's a lot of other things taking place here, but I only have 45 minutes, not 45 years to get into that. But there's some discussions about moving Jamestown over to the Eastern Shore, just moving it over. It was a better place to live, mortality rate was better, and just come over. I think that our sandy soil proved to be a mechanism for cleaning, because it was a lot of the human runoff that was killing these people. They were really pinned up in the stockades, and they weren't really good at PR over around Jamestown. My wife and I went down where someone I started talking to one of the folks in Jamestown. And he says, "Oh, so you people are from the Eastern Shore. You're really, I forgot exactly. You're really dressed a little funny." And I said, "Yeah, well, we don't. We have beaches. We have a lot of fun. We didn't try to teach the Native Americans religion. We just got along with them." And so there was this movement for religion around Jamestown, and I think that created some of the problems. But I don't know. They really talk a lot about what they were. They weren't well adapted to it. They weren't growing the, only that the people that had been in Low Countries in Ireland knew how, like Gates and Dale, had the experience to live in these terrible conditions. Some of the dandies just couldn't make it. And the king was afraid that the Spanish would see that as failure. And so he wanted to stick to the on course. And so the royal government took over Virginia in 1623-24. And the first thing they did is they had an inventory of people and assets. And that's called the 1623-24 census. And from that, most of us who study this began our research of our roots. So let's put 1624 in perspective, the year of the census. 1607, landing. Shortly thereafter, the census was taken. This is today. So the Declaration of Independence is almost on the 50-yard line. So there's an awful lot taking place in this country prior to that. 1651, we're already starting to get a little fed up with the guys that wear wigs across the way. So the census of 1623-24, there were 71 people here. 2 had been born here, so they were Virginians, and 69 were European. This is just a partial piece of that list. But one of them, William Epps, came over in 1618. He came on the ship William and Thomas, and he was a commander on the Eastern Shore. He was no longer the commander of Smith's 100 because he had a temper. It seems that he got upset at a guy that worked for him, so he took his sword. He didn't bother to take it out of the scabbard, but he took his sword and he hit the guy over the head, just trying to drive some sense into him, and cleaved his head wide open. So they said, "We're going to send you to the Eastern Shore." And interesting, on the same boat is a guy named John Throckmorton. Throckmorton is either the brother-in-law or nephew of Governor Dale. And my ancestor, John Baker, is one of a dozen who come over a few years later, and he's related to Epps, and he is an indentured servant. Indentured servant means that he's signed a contract that he'll work for 5 years, and actually the indenture was with the Virginia Company. He'll work 5 years, and at the conclusion of that, they'd give him 50 acres of land, and he would start his own life. And there were 12 people in that boat, and their age, he was roughly 23. So more than likely, that group of 12 were sailors, soldiers, and had already had some prior experience. There's one fellow on here, Charles Harmer, who's interesting. He's a muster master, and he's got 3 people living in his muster, and they're all indentured to him to stay. I'm going to stay with Harmer for a second. He marries a girl right just across the mouth of the bay. He marries Anne Southey. And Henry is, I've given, but sometimes that name seems to be in some question. But Henry came over with his entire family the year before. He and his wife and 6 children. Elizabeth and his daughter Anne are the only ones that survived after a year. Mortality, they had died of the Virginia disease. That's what they called it. So mortality was like in the 80% range, got slightly better in the Jamestown side, and it was only 50% on the Eastern Shore. Can you imagine somebody saying, "Hey, why don't you go to the Eastern Shore?" Only half the people died there. So I tried to understand more about Charles Harmer in light of what we're talking about tonight, and there was very little, but I did find that his brother was from Churston in England, and I said, "Well, where is Churston?" And I plotted it, and I went, "Oh my gosh, the next place is Lady Dale's, or would be Governor Dale's mother-in-law, was where she was born, and just up the road a piece is where his father-in-law was born, And just across the water was where his brother-in-law, William Throckmorton, the Berkeley Hundred guy, lived. So obviously, they were in the affinity of the Berkeleys and Throckmortons. And this again just repeats itself over and over and over in the research. You just have to keep looking. Peter Ten Arve and I both were amazed as we went through in the Low Country records the mobility of these early settlers. Many of these people traveled more than many of the people in this room. And 1628, after being over here 5 years and not killing anybody, William Epps was asked to go and become the commander and second in charge of St. Kitts Island in the Caribbean. The Spanish came in the following year and attacked them and chased them out. And I believe that he might have taken four or five people from his Eastern Shore detachment with him when he went there. Because 4 years later, his brother reappears on the Upper James River, almost on the same property that Governor Dale had been given. And he's got these folks tagging along with him. Two of those are in his, he claims head rights on, Baker and Morton. After they're here for a while, their children marry and come back to the Eastern Shore. It'll be a ritual long repeated over the 400 years. So the map in 1607, I was talking about mobility. There's this heavy concentration in the Low Countries and Ireland, but in the Caribbean, all the way up trying to get across the Northwest Passage, trying to get Moscow, the Moscow Company was created because they were trying to find a way to get here. And we have these factories, they call them factories, in the East Indies. So, and then of course Drake went around here. He had no idea about, there wasn't a map. There wasn't GPS. He just went. There were 4 ships, I believe. His is the only one that made it. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, we all today owe these people so much. Got here, there were differences starting to appear right away. In one generation, a yeoman class started appearing here in America. And it had it somewhat in England, but it was very rare because they had such a stratified social system. So John Baker, my ancestor, becomes a yeoman. He would have never had that chance in England at the time. A yeoman was someone who had, by his own moxie and hard work, sounds like the American story, doesn't it? Had developed some degree of financial independence, and land holdings, yeah. And there were differences developing between the Eastern Shore and the Western Shore. So the difference is geographic access from the Eastern Shore to the other colonies, the Caribbean, was easier. I think that was part of the reason. We grew some tobacco, but we had more tobacco merchants. We had the mariners. We had trade with the other colonies. We had Dutch here and some others, but we had more. We had Dutch. They had obviously followed over from the Low Country. When in Quebec, when the French tried, the French had been fighting alongside of the English. So when they tried to get Quebec, you got English soldiers going up and raiding them. These have been soldiers from the Low Country. We got shipbuilders here. Wood is a premium in England. It's getting scarce, so they're building ships here. We had soldiers, and we had what we call this jack of all trades. The Eastern Shoreman was sort of a jack of all trades. But I think probably this jack of all trades is the reason for this Commonwealth of the Eastern Shore being discussed. About 16, the winners always write history, so it's a little hard to tell. But this was being talked about in the 1632 area about having a separate colony called the Commonwealth of the Eastern Shore. The Kent Island had been built over 6 or 7 years. Actually, there's records of people being contracted from the lower Eastern Shore to go up to provide translation services, to build boats, to build stockades. So we were helping the lower shore to help them build that. And then it was a very convoluted story, but William Claiborne really gets the raw end of the political stick. And so he starts talking to his wife's uncle about forming this Commonwealth with some of these islands, Bermuda, Providence Island, some of these islands in the Caribbean. Hey. So Governor Thomas Dale is someone who I mentioned I had studied. I wanted to learn more about Dale's gift, and he's still difficult to understand, but he was a captain in France, in Ireland, in Holland. He spent very little time in England, actually, and when he was there, he got thrown in jail for supporting Devereux in his bid to take some power in England. He married this Elizabeth Throckmorton when they were both over the age of 40, and there's no record they either were married before. He was the third governor of Virginia and given credit for stabilizing the language. Had it not been for Dale, there's a good chance we all might have been speaking Spanish from the outset. Admiral of the fleet, he was picked to go to help a guy named Christopher Newport. You ever hear of Christopher Newport? Christopher Newport is dying on the other side of the world in the Spice Islands, and Dale's trying to get over there to help him. Dale sails over. I think it was a fairly quick trip. I think it took him 9 months. And when he landed on the scene, he was fresh and ready, and got killed. Or actually, he died, but they had severe combat, and it was probably from that or a mosquito bite, one of the two, but he died there. And in his will, he named 4 overseers, and 2 of those we already talked about tonight. And the third one is a guy named the Earl of Southampton, and we'll talk about him in a moment. And prior to coming to Virginia, he had been a captain in the Low Country. He and Gates. Gates was the second governor. And they were stationed in Old Water Garrison. And Peter Tenarve and I went there and drank beer in a tavern that was in operation when they were there. So we got a table for 4, sat down, and I hoped their spirits would come and talk to us and give us some tips. And all I got was a headache the next day. So Lady Dale passed, and she had inherited the property from her husband, Dale's gift, and she named 2 people. And so I went, I know the 4 overseers of Dale, and I've got 2 people that she named, William Shrimpton and Richard Hamby. And sure enough, when I laid out some genealogy, I went, oh my gosh, there's a relationship, there's a kinship here. And I knew a little bit about Richard Hamby, so I looked at him more. I knew that he had a great uncle named Thomas Dale. So I took a really hard look at this, and I knew that I later discovered this Thomas Dale is somehow related to Governor Dale, but I'm not exactly sure. You can see he died in 1571. But his property was adjacent to George Smith's property. And George Smith was the father of Captain John Smith of Disney World fame. And their overlord was a guy named Willoughby. I'm like, gee, that's pretty interesting, but who's Willoughby? Maybe he's going to sound like a detective. And I go, oh my gosh, Willoughby's the second of 4 consecutive commanders in the Low Country. The first was Robert Dudley, the beau of Queen Elizabeth. And he incidentally was the overlord of Dale's future father-in-law. Willoughby was the second. He followed, and that's the same year as Governor Dale appears on the scene as a soldier. The third is Richard Vere, who recommissions Dale as a captain. He lost his commission when he got in trouble in the Essex Rebellion. And then the fourth is Horace, his Richard's brother. Horace and Dale both were celebrated heroes of battles in the Low Country. They both stood and stopped the Spanish forces from overtaking and killing all of their men. He married Lady Dale's first cousin. We're talking about kinships and how they can help you study. He purchased a Throckmorton home place when they got in financial trouble. And incidentally, there was another William Epps who was not so successful. He died in the Low Countries, and he is a celebrated hero in poetry. So kinships were everything, and the way that I used to begin to go through here. I saw Thomas Dale at Alfred. I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's go through this one more time. And lo and behold, I come up with, I don't know where she sat, but your ancestor, William Stone. I'm going to pretend it's your ancestor. William Stone's really an interesting guy. In Maryland history, he's the first non-Catholic governor of Maryland. He spent 20 years living on the Eastern Shore and working on the Eastern Shore before he went over there. And we hardly even talk about that. And he met Epps in Nevis Island in the Caribbean. And they talked about, hey, you know, I just got chased away. I got this land over on the Eastern Shore. We'd like to run it. Could you manage it? Could you buy it? And they worked out a deal. And Stone comes to the Eastern Shore, and it's the Epps property that he first manages and then buys. So look down here. All of these transactions I'm talking about taking place down in this area, yet really affect our history. Because Stone, I'll mention how he's important in Maryland in a few more minutes. So all of these are characters, all interrelated, tightly interrelated. So let's talk about the Upper Eastern Shore. We've been talking about the lower, on Old Plantation Creek. So what was happening, was anything happening up here? Well, around Lewis, Delaware, we had Dutch. And they really weren't settlers. That was a fort where they could go out and hunt for whale and where they could do fur trading. And then I talked about over here, Claiborne's Kent Island plantation being developed. And then up here was one of the most fascinating, was Palmer Island, right in the mouth of the Susquehanna River. Edward Palmer in 1620 had made so much money buying, trading for fur, that he was going to build a university in the colonies every bit as big as Oxford University, where he had a relative teaching. Death took him in 1622, and that didn't get done, but that's a fairly well-documented moment that he was going to do. I knew about him through some relationships. So that's what's happening on the upper end of the shore. Charles Harmer dies, and his widow remarries a fellow named Nathaniel Littleton. So who is Nathaniel Littleton? Well, it's interesting. He was serving in the Low Country with the Earl of Southampton, the third of the 4 overseers of the Dale will. His kinsman was Thomas Littleton, the governor of Nevis. Nevis is the island where Stone and Epps got together to talk about buying the land. His brother was the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, distantly related to Lady Dale, and took out his first land grant in 1626. About within 10 years, he moved here. So what's a land grant? He had this property here, and he took property on the 1634, and that's where he did his fur trading. At that time, in 1634, that was the frontier of the Virginia colony, on this side. So a land grant is I pay your freight, your ticket to go to England, go from England to, or from the Low Countries to Virginia. I get to claim and ask for 50 acres of land. So if I send 10 people, I get to claim 50 acres, and it's called a land patent, and it gives me the right to then develop that property. So I looked at the Nathaniel Littleton 1626, and here are the names of the people. Oh, one of them was a baker, so I put him in red. So be proud of that. And I see these names. So first time I ever talked about this was with Ray, and it was fascinating because he had long thought that this was the case. Almost 3 decades later, Nathaniel dies, and he asked his neighbor, Daniel Baker, to be a witness and also take care of his son. No doubt it's the same Daniel Baker that he had claimed on the headright. He asked a friend, a neighbor, Francis Potts, to be a trustee of his daughter, Esther. And then 2 years later, when his wife dies, she asks her, using the term sister, meaning friend, Mrs. Thomasia, or Susanna Baker, who is Daniel Baker's sister, to take care of her children. So young Daniel, the young boy, is only 9 years old, Southey Littleton. So his overseer is Daniel Baker. So in 1656, 9-year-old Southey Littleton takes out a land patent So I can see this guy Baker's got he's playing some games here. So Southey Littleton's land patent were for these people. Oh my, that looks almost like the same list of people. With the exception of two at the end, and I could almost see them out at the end of the dock. And they came up with the name Dick of the Frigate and Connor the Irishman. So there was a land patent scam, and the king wanted it. He was putting pressure on the governors, the royal governors, to settle this land. The royal governors were passing it along, and everyone wanted to do that. The king's reason was he wanted to show the other countries that he was doing something with this, so he wouldn't be challenged. And everyone else wanted their, including him, wanted their piece of the take, the part of the tax. So let's talk about Susanna Baker, because she married a succession of really interesting people. She first married Thomas Eyre. Thomas Eyre was an officer in the Virginia Company and actually a partner in a side group that put 200 Puritans on Isle of Wight across the bay. He might have gone back, but we do know that he came down to the eastern shore shortly thereafter, now enthusiastic about the new Quaker movement taking place on the shore, and it was the first to establish some of the first Quaker meeting houses. He's been lost in the Quaker history. His neighbor is Captain William Stone. We talked about him. He bought Epps's land. Well, Stone needs to get settlers, Protestant settlers, to go into St. Mary's for some other political reasons. So he goes over to Isle of Wight. Obviously, Eyre made that introduction for him and gets 500 Puritans and takes them up to what we know as Annapolis today. And that became a Puritan settlement. Thomas died, and Susanna met one of my favorite characters, Captain Francis Potts. He was a commander of the fort just across the bay. His brother was Governor John Potts, Dr. John Potts. They were from Harrop. And then Potts got moved out, and a tyrant of a governor came in, John Harvey. If you've got any relatives here, I'm sorry, but he was a tyrant. And to witness that, Potts has some trouble. He's upset with the governor because the governor's going to hang him. And it upsets people. I can understand that. So he and his buddies break him out of jail, and they go and they kidnap the governor, and they hog tie him, and they throw him on a boat, and they sail back to England, and they go to the king, and they throw him in front of him and said, "We don't want him, he's yours." So the king had a bit of a problem. Harvey had lost all of his problem. He tried to support him, but lost all of his problem. When Potts gets back to Virginia, he comes and resettles on the eastern shore. Being married to Susanna was obviously a dangerous thing because he died within a year, and I'm not, believe me, I'm not insinuating anything there. It's just, so she remarries Colonel William Kendall. Kendall was the Speaker of the House of Burgess. I mean, this is like Nancy Pelosi. Well, I don't know about that, but Speaker of the House, and she had accumulated 8,000 acres of land prior to marriages. And Kendall is interesting because he's asked, just giving you some flair for how this goes together, he's asked to go to Albany, New York to negotiate a peace treaty between the New Yorkers and the Iroquois Indians. And he takes with him his unofficial stepson, Southey Littleton, because Southey grew up in that trading post that I mentioned that his father started. And he understood the customs, he understood the language, and the two were asked to go to New York to settle. And the Iroquois were the fiercest of the native tribes. So Southey Littleton and Nandua River is where his father had built that, and that's where he grew up. And obviously, you can see at that point in time, it had been on the frontier of the colonies. And then he was asked by the governor to go put down Bacon's Rebellion. If you've been to Williamsburg or Jamestown, you've heard about Bacon's Rebellion. That's where some very upset folks went in and actually burned part of Jamestown and chased the governor out. And he came to the eastern shore. He came down to Old Plantation Creek, and that's where he got his protection, and Southey took the captains. They were all Eastern Shore men, and went over, subdued the rebels, executed them, and replaced the governor. It allowed the governor to go back. And then when he was up on the commission with Kendall in Albany, he took ill one evening and passed, and they brought his body back here. No one knows why he died. 1649 and 1650, the Virginia Merchant is a ship of cavaliers. And they spent at least 30 days floating around the ocean because a storm had broken their rudder and their mast. And they were gambling, they were paying huge amounts of money for rats. Anybody buy a rat, they would sell it on the boat. Finally, the ship nudged into shore around Fenwick Island. And when that happened, one of the fellows, Norwood, got off with 6 of the very worst shape passengers. And while he was trying to get them on shore, for other various reasons, the ship took off and left them. And that's nice, being left in Fenwick Island. I mean, that's nice. And so all the men died except Norwood, because at least he was healthy at the time. A terrible ice storm. And so as a result of that, an English fur trader actually found him and took him to a Native American tribe where they fed him, dressed him, nursed him back to health. And then they led them all the way down to the Littleton trading post. And he writes about that, and I think they have some records in here. He writes about that, and along that path there was no other Europeans other than the fellow the trader who was probably working that whole area. And we do know that there were some people up in this area, but the people that he passed in his trip. So, I don't know if you remember the commercial. So where's the beef? So where's the sin? We build it on sin, and it's a really interesting reason for that. Quakers were really a tremendous group of people. They were the most successful merchants, and they didn't believe that you could have a person or an institution to represent you with God. That was their main claim, and they were very peaceful. And so the Church of England really started putting pressure on them because they weren't paying the church because they weren't members. And it says this became really out of control in Virginia, and they could not even write their name on a contract. If their name appeared on a contract, they'd be fined 500 pounds of tobacco, which was a huge amount of money. And the person that signed with them, if they weren't a Quaker, were fined, but just not as much. And if this happened a second time, they were jailed, and it happened a third time, they could be executed. I mean, they were treated terrible. And if they were not a member of the church, then they were deemed living in sin. And I've researched this many times, and I hear a little old lady say, "Oh, what I discovered was I had an ancestor born in sin." And I'd say, well, it could be that they were Quakers. Oh, I hope so. And I said, but the point was that was one of the ways that they were trying to put pressure on the Quakers. So one of the things to get around this, Baker signed their name as Barker. For a long time, I just thought they couldn't write. Waterloo sometimes is Wallop. Eyre is Eyre. The Eyre is generally the Quaker element of the Daniel Eyre was the son of Thomas Eyre and Susan Baker, and became a major leader of the Quaker movement. Here's an example, William Colburn. I think many of you have heard this name here. Here's a document where he and Henry White and some others were asked or told to go to Jamestown, and there they had to take their spouse, and they had to sign a document that said that they would give up this Quaker stuff. And you can see that Colburn, he's my kind of guy. Whoever's making notation says, this refused to be subscribed by William Colburn. His wife signed, but William Colburn refused. And then shortly thereafter, we suddenly see that he's a lieutenant in the Maryland, in Somerset County, reporting to Captain Thorne of the Foot. And he is to make treaty with the Nanticokes. So it's interesting to see. And so, Ray and I were saying that's the biggest message out of this. Historians should pay more attention to genealogy, and genealogists should really study the history, because then they would it all comes together much better. Merchant's Hope, 1663. So this nonsense goes on almost 15 years. And it gets worse and worse. Merchant's Hope in 1663, an entire Quaker community was eradicated. Their places burned, their goods taken. They were chased out. They weren't allowed to take ship. They had to walk. They had to find ways. The natives struck them, many of them down. And they weren't allowed to leave the state, but they couldn't live there, or the colony, but they couldn't live there. It was just terrible. So some came over the eastern shore, but first, their elder was a guy named Francis Whittington. Well, let's see if he meets the same standard of kinships that in my research. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Elder Francis Whittington, who was the leader of Merchant's Hope, is related to Thomas and Lady Dale, distantly related to Nathaniel and Southey Littleton. So every one of these people meet the kinship test. And, interestingly enough, Merchant's Hope was just across the river from where Dale's property, the other property on the eastern, that Thomas Dale had been gifted all the way back in 1619. So where did the Quakers go? I mentioned some went up into St. Mary's. They found their way by path. And a lot of the people helped smuggle them there. It's interesting to look at, you can figure that, once you know this, looking at some of those land patents are very helpful. Land patents really will reflect the movement of those people. And they came over here, and we're going to get into more detail exactly where on the eastern shore. But a guy named Edmund Scarborough. Anybody here related to Edmund Scarborough? Well, I'm sorry what I'm going to say. He was one scoundrel. And he hated just about everyone except himself. And he put so much pressure on the Quakers that they went up into St. Mary's, or they came up into right above the Virginia line, or they came up into Worcester County. Scarborough didn't like that, so we had the line moved through shenanigans 30 miles. And so suddenly these Quakers were now re-exposed to the wrath of Edmund Scarborough. Interesting guy at Scarborough, because he was about as brilliant, I think, as someone could be. He had just applied himself along the wrong course. So we start seeing some of these Quakers coming up, all the way up in what was Baltimore Hundred. And we see, when you live on a system where you all defend one another in a militia kind of thing, and the guy on the right and the left don't want to fight, you're starting to get some problems. And so there was pressure to pressure the Quakers over into Talbot, into Dorchester, down into Somerset. So you get some movement here, and you get more movement up here. But one of the fascinating things that came out as I was looking at all of this is there's a little place called Gargatha, right before you come into Maryland, just below Chincoteague. And that was settled by people that did not meet any of the Quaker, or they were from St. Mary's and Catholics and a whole different group. And I believe what was happening, because these people up in Baltimore Hundred, and we're talking about maybe making that a study because it's so interesting. And people up there were complaining and writing letters to Maryland officials. We need help. We're being, we can't get supplies. We have attacks on us by Dutch traders, by natives. We need help. And I think that this was an attempt to be a resupply of people and food items, to that area. So I said I would talk about where the Quakers initially came. They all came in really a tight little area, which we know as Hack's Neck. This was the Littleton Trading Post. We're back to the same place, and this Hack's Neck. So I took a look at some of the people that any of us that study this, we know all of these names, but these were pieces of property they owned on this side just below that area, and on this side, just above that. Many of early names of the Eastern Shore. And that didn't mean they necessarily lived there, but they owned property there, because it might have been tobacco or another crop by that point of time. Nicholas Swaddlow was a Quaker, and I think a good representative example of what's going on. You know, they were sort of slim pickings in those times because there weren't many people. And he married a gal who was a widow, and she already had a couple children. And then when he died, she remarried. So we start seeing this family developing. And out of this family, we got some names that we know on the Eastern Shore very well, but they appeared up there in that Baltimore Hundred at the time: Abbott, Baker, Barker, Parker, Ayers, White, Bundick, Clark. These are names that suddenly, coming out of this whole this area and this Quaker movement, start moving up. So I thought folks would be interested in seeing how this development was. I think you see that. So the Virginians from Northampton tended to prefer coming up the Barrier Islands, but there was some movement up into off of the Tangier Sound. The Marylanders came across, and that's why you get more development on that side. And the Dutch were coming down from New York, Pennsylvania, and they got down as far as this area. And there were some Swedes coming down with the Dutch. And that becomes the sort of a macro view of the development. So the population after 50 years of colonization, it's really difficult to tell because there was the land scams. You can't really trust the names that are on there, and mortality rate was so high. Some cases they would not report mortality because they didn't want to scare other developers coming in. For example, they knew that Roanoke had been wiped out, but they just did not want to report that back to England. But I can tell you that the population of the Eastern Shore was smaller than, probably by 2, on any aircraft carrier that steams out of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. So let's go back to Hack's Neck, because it was very interesting. Daniel Baker again, Littleton's fellow, had a brother, Edward, and they had friends called George Hack, and George Hack had a brother-in-law, Augustine Herman. Anyone that's read his history would know Augustine Herman did the map of Maryland. He was contracted to do that. You might also know they had a 40,000-acre plantation at the very top of the bay. They had a fundraiser there just a month ago. George Hack and his brother-in-law were the largest single exporters of tobacco from North America. And they were operating out of what we know as Manhattan, New York. Where were they getting? You been to Manhattan lately? I mean, they obviously were buying that from somewhere. And I believe Daniel Baker and Edward Baker were 2 of the people in their little group that were bringing this. In fact, we know that Edward Baker, he was living in London at that time. He arranged for the sale of his property from Waterloo to Hack because his name was on the contract, and he didn't worry about taking the hit for this. So he was protecting Waterloo and Hack on this. So this gives you an idea of what's happening. So suddenly there's some wars, business wars go on between England and the Dutch about trading rights, 1651, 52. And Hack suddenly appears at what we know as Hack's Neck, right down here on the Eastern Shore. Georgius, Joris was his name up there, and now his name here he takes an English George. So what I believe was happening is that there was a smuggling ring going on with tobacco, and I'll continue to study this, but just think about how tobacco was working. If you bought tobacco, you had to pay a duty on it, and then you took this tobacco to England, you got an arbitrary price for your tobacco because the king of England was buying it, or his people were buying it and reselling it to the continent because it was really in demand on the continent. So it was an arbitrary price that they set. So what was happening is you see the hack name in some of the Caribbean islands. And they were using these islands to bring together and then ship tobacco over to continental Europe, where they got a much better price. And incidentally, they forgot to pay the customs, I would guess. So I'll continue to study that, but I believe that it would be very difficult to not say that happened. And let's go back down to Old Plantation Creek, where we started this evening. And there was a house down there. This is a rendering of it, the Arlington House. And the Custis family came in. They actually were, you think of them as Dutch, but they actually were English and left England and went to Holland because of political pressure. And they were from a place called Arlington. And so the Arlington House. And I started looking at, well, where's Arlington? And I won't bother you with a map of Arlington, but the neighbors of the Arlington House, or Arlington, is Lady Dale's grandfather. It's unbelievable, these connections. I feel like I should be a private detective. So we're in the same place, and one of the things that has often been said is that Arlington Mansion in our National Cemetery was taken or inspired by Arlington House. Arlington House that I showed you was supposed to be the finest house in all of the colonies. And so I thought, well, is that true? And there's hundreds of pages of arguments of if that's true or not. So I won't even bother to get into that. But I will say it's interesting that John Custis' son married a nice lady named Martha Danbridge. And when her husband died, she remarried a guy named George Washington. We all know him. And George Washington actually helped raise his stepchild, John Parke Custis. And within a couple generations, Robert E. Lee gives up Arlington Mansion because he knows the Union forces are going to come in and take it. And it's been a national possession ever since that time. So I do believe that that's a part that Arlington on the Lower Eastern Shore did have this influence on Arlington Cemetery. So questions about this wonderfully rich history we have on the shore. You know I love it, so any questions you might have. Now I'm going to ask a question. How many of you have been in the NAB Center over here? Good for you. And I don't know how many are listening out there, but you all should come do it. It is great. Well, thank you very much.